Welcome to Episode 7 of the Saunders Aircraft Story. As Saunders Aircraft was in the process of settling in at CFB Gimli, the Winnipeg Free Press on February 22, 1971, ran a full-page feature article in the business section about Saunders Aircraft. The article, written by John McManus, covered the whole page. The Free Press stated that the federal government would put up $750,000 under the Regional Economic Expansion Program, and that the province of Manitoba, through the Manitoba Development Corporation, had staked Saunders Aircraft to $2.5 million in loans and grants. Rich Kersey, the plant manager at Gimli, went on to say that Saunders had orders for 5 of $425,000 airplanes, 2 to Nord Air. Carl Millard had ordered 1, and 2 to the Chicago Aviation Center. Saunders Aircraft had hired 20 people from the Gimli area, bringing the staff total to 25. However, aviation sources in Manitoba had given the ST-27 a cool reception because of the short runway length in many Manitoba northern airports. Transair had shown some interest in ST-27 last year, but now we're able to buy used de Havilland Twin Otters at a lower price. Another criticism was that the ST-27 was not pressurized and is restricted to lower altitudes. Kersey stated that this is not a commuter market that Saunders is trying to reach. Other aviation sources were worried about the slowness of the aircraft certification. The ST-27 had been certified as airworthy by the British ARB, and that the Canadian and DOT FAA authorities were expected to follow suit shortly. Kersey also said that under a reciprocal agreement, DOT can give aircraft certification for FAA, and the FAA can give aircraft approval for the DOT. Though Kersey probably knew that the reciprocal FAA approval may not happen for the ST-27. Dave Saunders did not want to move to Gimli. He did not want his aircraft company, Saunders Aircraft, to move to Gimli either. The board of directors, seeing this impasse, voted out Dave Saunders as president of Saunders Aircraft. Dave Saunders had earlier lost controlling interest in his company when he had sold much of his shares in the company to keep Saunders Aircraft afloat in 1970. The new president of Saunders Aircraft was William Kelly. William Kelly was from Newcastle, Delaware. William Kelly had joined Mohawk Airlines in 1967 as the vice president of corporate administration after serving in the U.S. Navy for 26 years. Kelly had a BA degree in economics and a master's degree in business administration. Kelly was 54 years old when he joined Saunders Aircraft. Other aviation news in Winnipeg at this time was that CAE, who had taken over the Air Canada overhaul base in Winnipeg, received word on April 8 that the contract to overhaul U.S. Air Force T-39 Sabreliner jets was canceled. CAE expected that 300 jobs would be lost in Winnipeg. Manitoba Development Corporation had loaned CAE over $1 million to keep the old Air Canada overhaul base going. Also in the news was that the provincial auditor found that MDC loans to Churchill Forest Industries in Nepal were not made in accordance with agreements. When the province had placed CFI in receivership in January and expected to find $6.5 to $15 million in the CFI bank account, the amount found was substantially less. A special audit of CFI loans at MDC was to be done. The news on CAE and CFI would not affect Saunders Aircraft directly, but would mean that future loans by MDC would be scrutinized by the media. The DOT task of inspection at Saunders Aircraft was transferred to the DOT Central Region out of Winnipeg. Ames, a DOT inspector out of Winnipeg, would visit the Saunders operation in Montreal, then at Gimli, to familiarize himself with the ST-27 construction. A meeting between DOT and Saunders Aircraft was held in Gimli on April 21, 1972, with Owen, Pope, and Gallinger representing DOT from Ottawa, Kay Blower representing the DOT Winnipeg office, Representing Saunders Aircraft was the new Saunders president, William Kelly, and plant manager, Reg Kersey. ATL was represented by Muriel, Leffley, and Grout. Saunders Aircraft would pay the traveling expenses for ATL out of the UK to Gimli. Items discussed was ST-27 items remaining so that Canadian validation of the ARB type certificate could proceed. DOT received a letter from the FAA New York office noting 2 additional special conditions proposed for the FAA certification of the ST-27. These new items were the aisle width and the integral stair door. After a month on the job, President William Kelly presented a frank assessment of the Saunders operation to MDC. Kelly's report was titled, "A Hard Look at Saunders." The report introduction stated that the first 3 orders to the USA for Chicago and Southern Airlines were canceled because the FAA certification to 13,500 pounds had not occurred, but the FAA type certificate for a gross weight at 12,500 pounds may occur in the near future, but this would only authorize the ST-27 to operate at a weight of 12,500 pounds, and that the ST-27 at that lower weight was not competitive. The Canadian certification for a gross weight at 13,500 is expected shortly. The report went on to say that currently Saunders Aircraft is almost building planes by hand in an old converted World War II hangar and living financially month to month on the grace of a quasi-government organization which is hoping we survive and adds to the provincial economy. The interest rate on the Saunders loan is double the current prime rate of 5%, which forces Saunders Aircraft to operate in an extremely uneconomic manner. The first priority for Saunders is the FAA FAR 25 certification at 13,500 pounds. Saunders is investigating a British certificate of airworthiness export license through reciprocal agreements that are in place that have a FAR 25 certificate issue through the FAA office in Brussels, Belgium. ATL has scheduled a conference at the ARB in London during the last week in April to see if the approval approach is possible, and if so, what the detailed procedure would be and how long it would take. It is estimated the process would take 4 to 6 months. The order cancellation makes ST-27 number 14129 CF-XOK available to be positioned in the UK for a concentrated flight test aimed at getting an ARB export license sooner. CF-XOK can accomplish the work necessary to extend the ARB type certificate to cover warm weather operations, but this will require repositioning the aircraft to an area offering 95 Fahrenheit. An immediate target for aircraft sales was Nigeria, brokered through the Montreal office of R. Dixon Spears. Saunders was offering a fixed-gear version of the ST-27 for $470,000 and quoted deliveries of 6 airplanes starting on October 1st. William Kelly planned to take the Spears study with him when he traveled to Nigeria in early May, hoping to close the sale. Kelly went on to say if the ST-27 was to operate in the FAR 25 transport category, there was an enormous amount of work to do at Saunders. The illustrated parts catalog for the ST-27 only describes the Huron and must not only be updated, but must be realigned with the new part numbers in accordance with the Airline Transportation Association ATA 100 numbering system. The Saunders marketing strategy must concentrate immediately on those areas of the world where the ST-27 is or would be authorized to operate. The U.S. market would hopefully become available, but Saunders dares not wait for it. Kelly noted that high priority must be given to the design of the follow-up airplane to the ST-27 so that the company can grow into the dominant force in the industry. On May 19, 1971, Saunders Aircraft did receive some good news that Transport Canada type approval A-106 had been issued to cover the ST-27 aircraft. This meant that the ST-27 could now be flown in commercial service in Canada and other countries that accepted the Canadian DOT type certificate and it could be flown at the 13,500-pound gross weight. After MDC received William Kelly's report, William Houston, Secretary of the Manitoba Development Corporation, MDC, prepared a letter to the Board of Directors outlining the Saunders situation. Houston wrote that MDC had no chairman in place after Rex Gross had resigned as chairman in March 1970. Houston outlined that the cancellation of orders from U.S. carriers and a possible 4 to 6 month delay in the FAA certification of the ST-27 had resulted in another cash crisis for Saunders Aircraft. Saunders President William Kelly had returned from Nigeria and felt that the chances for the sale of 6 aircraft appeared to be good, and a decision is imminent. Chief Aja of Lago, Nigeria is visiting Saunders Aircraft in Gimli next month. Should the Nigerian orders materialize, deliveries have been scheduled and promised for July through September 1971 and November through January 1972. MDC had already advanced a total of $1,250,000 to Saunders in the form of direct loans and bank guarantees. Saunders Aircraft would require immediate cash fusion of $160,000 to be able to continue work on the 2 airframes currently under conversion. A further $220,000 would be required in June and a similar amount in July. Should MDC consider advancing further monies to Saunders, the security would only consist of the 2 completed aircraft, 003 and 004, and the once completed aircraft 001. Mr. Parsons and Houston from NDC had numerous discussions with the management of Saunders Aircraft, and they felt confident Saunders management was on the right track. MDC would advance Saunders Aircraft another $600,000. June 1, 1971 would see the Manitoba government hire Peter Charles Bryant as the next chairman of MDC. Bryant was born on May 3, 1924, in London, England, and would serve as a RAF pilot in World War II. Bryant received his Ph.D. in economics from Michigan University in 1959. Bryant would take a leave of absence from where he was vice dean of the economics department at McGill University in Montreal. Bryant would state in an interview with the Winnipeg Tribune that a public loan has to weigh the social benefits such as the creation of jobs and other economic offshoots from the main project. Another Tribune article reported that 20 laid-off CAE workers had found employment at Saunders Aircraft, and that the total number of workers at Saunders Aircraft in June was 76. Premier Ed Schreier and Industry Minister Len Evans would travel to Ottawa in June to lobby the federal government for work at CAE to keep the CAE workers employed. The Manitoba Development Corporation would stay in the news when Abraham Thiessen, the former owner of Western Flyer Coach, also known as Flyer Industries, accused the former chairman, MDC Rex Gross, and the NDC Board of Directors of conniving to bring in American business consultant Thomas Ault to run Western Flyer Coach, the Fort Garry-based manufacturing firm. MDC announced that the Lake Winnipeg cruise ship, the Lord Selkirk, would operate for the 1971 season, and the Lord Selkirk was looking into possibilities of being operated in the winter as a floating hotel. For the first time in its 13-year history, MDC would make public the loans it had made for the period of July 31st, 1970 to March 31st, 1971. The largest loan was to the Church of Forest Industry project at $5.5 million. Second were 3 loans at $1.35 million each. First to A.E. Mackenzie Seeds in Brandon, Kilby Industries of Winnipeg, which later became MacDon Industries, and $1.35 million to Saunders Aircraft of Gimli. Also in June, Saunders Aircraft purchased de Havilland Heron, serial number 14087, had been delivered to the South African Air Force in 1955. This Heron would be sold as surplus by the South African Air Force in 1962 and would be bought by the English Electric Company, a large UK aviation firm, and to be used as executive air transport until it was purchased by Saunders Aircraft for conversion to an ST-27. Questions arose between Saunders Aircraft and DOT on whether Heron 14087 needed to be inspected and required a DOT certificate of airworthiness. However, 14087 had a valid UK certificate of airworthiness and would be accepted by the Canadian DOT, thus saving Saunders the time and expense of reinspection. Bring the prototype up to the current ST-27 build standard and would now meet the ST-27 DOT type certificate requirements. The registration number would be amended from CFYBMX to CFYBM, and now 001 could be put into commercial use. One day in June, a small group of local Gimli business people were invited on the spur of the moment by Saunders President William Kelly to have a short flight on the first aircraft to come off the assembly line at Gimli, followed by lunch at the Falcon. Those invited included Ted Jenkins, Mrs. Albrecht, Mrs. Laura Thurgenson, J.V. Arneson, Harold Dahlman, and Danny Sigmason. The Falcon was a fancy restaurant in Gimli at the time and later became the Whitecaps, then the Interlake Brewing Company. Provincial Cabinet Minister Len Evans and Peter Burtnick would also visit Saunders Aircraft in later June. Evans and Burtnick would have lunch at the Falcon with representatives from the town of Gimli, the Arm of Gimli, and the Gimli Chamber of Commerce and the Interlake Development Corporation. The main topic was a change in the Gimli Air Base to an industrial park. July would see ST-27 14059-004 completed. The ST-27 would be featured favorably in two in-depth articles in Aviation Week and Space Technology and Flight International magazines. The Winnipeg Free Press article named the new board of directors for Saunders Aircraft, consisting of William Kelly of Saunders Aircraft, Guy Croft of Winnipeg, Sidney Parsons of MDC, Stephen Calser of Calser, Lowenstein and Mead from Montreal, Millard from Millard Air in Toronto, Douglas G. McKay of Spartan Aero in Ottawa, David Saunders of Montreal, and Reg Kersey of Saunders. DOT was informed that A. Saltos of ATEL was named the acting chief engineer at Saunders. The DOT Montreal office would then transfer the Saunders files to the Winnipeg office in July. In July, there was word from the FAA office in Belgium. This news from the FAA was not what Saunders was hoping for. There would be no bilateral rubber stamp of the UK ARB certification for the ST-27. Plus, it was noted that since the aircraft was manufactured in Canada, DOT would be the main factor in the certification. Also, the FAA date of application was noted as July 12, 1971. It meant that FAA transport regulations had become more rigorous since 1969. Saunders Aircraft would have to coordinate with DOT, ARB, FAA, and ATEL for the path to certification. This many parties in the certification process meant that FAA certification would be slow and take time and money, both of which Saunders was short of. However, Saunders management was confident that sales of the ST-27 would be made to other countries, and work at Gimli continued. Saunders Aircraft needed additional sheet metal workers and would place job ads in the Winnipeg Free Press and the Winnipeg Tribune newspapers. A job fair was held at the International Inn in Winnipeg on August 7th. The response was poor to the ads and the job fair, so Saunders Aircraft teamed up with the Canada Manpower Office of the federal government to find skilled aircraft sheet metal workers. August 1971 brought some good news to Saunders Aircraft. 3 ST-27s, number 1, number 3, and number 4, were sold to Aerolíneas Centrales do Colombia, or better known as ACES. ACES headquarters was in Medellin, Colombia, and ACES started operations in August 1971 by a group of 13 Colombian entrepreneurs, most notably Orlando Bortell Escobar and Pizarro Arias from Manizales, and Louis H. Cozen provide the financing to ACES for the sale. William Kelly would travel to Ottawa and lobby the federal government for Export Development Corporation financing. Plus, Kelly hoped that the Columbia Ministry of Aviation would accept the Canadian DOT type certificate in lieu of the FAA type certificate. Some of the funds received on the sale to ACES would be used to repay Millard Air, who had earlier loaned money to Saunders on spec and had bought ST-27001. ACES would want a slightly more powerful PT6-34 engine installed on their ST-27s due to the higher terrain they would be operating at. Saunders would work with DOT, the ARB, and ATIL to get the PT6-34 engine emitted to the DOT and ARB type certificates. Sidney Parsons, the MDC chairman, prepared an update on Saunders Aircraft for the MDC board of directors. Parsons said that several meetings had been held with Saunders Aircraft, and Saunders Aircraft have provided a 5-year financial plan, which includes entering into Phase 2 of the operation, the production of a totally new aircraft. This would mean that MDC would have to put considerably more financing to Saunders Aircraft. The necessary financing to complete running the production line is $1.3 million. In view of the large investment that MDC will have in Saunders, Parsons proposed that MDC purchase the remaining outstanding shares, 1,418,413 shares, at a value of 50 cents per share. This number of shares plus the 400,000 stock option that MDC has will give MDC effective control of the business of Saunders Aircraft. MDC would be in a good position when Saunders Aircraft goes public, and MDC would see a substantial gain in the share price. The balance of the MDC financing would be a regular loan at the current interest rates. MDC's proposed stock purchase was conveyed to the shareholders at Saunders Aircraft. The shareholders were upset at the low evaluation of the share price, but they were not willing to put any further money into Saunders Aircraft. Parsons felt that further ST-27 sales would be forthcoming and that FAA certification should happen next spring. In closing, Parsons recommended MDC provide the $1.3 million only if MDC takes up the outstanding stock and has complete control of the company. If MDC was not to provide the loans, it is feasible that the company would fold by the end of 1973, and that of course would destroy the whole objective of MDC's involvement with Saunders Aircraft. The Saunders investors of Stoneview Corporation, Woodford Investments Limited, All Canadian Venture Fund, All Canadian Safari Fund, Prudential Insurance, and Martin Zigerman would take a 50% loss and sell their shares to MDC. The workers at Saunders Aircraft were unionized on August 26, 1971, and under the Saunders Workmen's Association. Saunders Aircraft was also considering imported experienced sheet metal workers from the UK and was in contact with Welltrade, a UK job shop company that specialized in supplying contract workers. Later in the fall, Saunders needed more room and moved from Hangar 1 to the large double hangar, Hangar 5. A small, simple ceremony was held at the Gimli Air Base on Tuesday, August 31st, when the Canadian Forces officially handed over the base to the province of Manitoba. Accepting the base for the province of Manitoba was Mr. Robert Gimli. Gimli would become the resident manager for the newly formed Gimli Industrial Park Corporation. Gimli was an architect with the Manitoba Department of Public Works. Gimli had been previously involved in the handover of the Cranberry Portage radar base to the province in 1964. The crews from ACES Airline in Columbia would arrive in Gimli in late October to begin training on the ST-27. A November 2nd snowstorm closed down the airport. The airport crews were scrambling for snow clearing equipment as the Air Force had taken most of the snow clearing equipment when they left CFB Gimli. Back in July, Saunders and ATEL had applied for FAA certification through the FAA European office. Saunders Aircraft even set up a Saunders UK show company to show Saunders Aircraft had a presence in the UK, and the process for FAA certification had started. On October 18th, Walter Haldeman of the FAA European office would inform ARB that since the production model of the ST-27 would be made in Canada and that the FAA UK bilateral agreement only deals with products produced in the UK, thus the FAA cannot issue a type certificate for the ST-27 model and validation of an ARB certification of compliance. The FAA advises that in view of the above decision, Saunders Aircraft Corporation of Canada should make application for an FAA type certificate of the Model 27 to the FAA Eastern Region Office through the Canadian Department of Transport. Saunders Aircraft would continue to face a shortage of skilled aircraft workers, and the 3 ST-27s had to be readied for the Colombian ACES sale. Saunders would contract with UK firm World Trade of Shannon, Ireland, to supply 40 experienced UK aircraft sheet metal workers for a 24-week period. The World Trade workers would arrive in Gimli in late November, though the UK workers thought they'd be worked for Saunders Aircraft in Montreal. The Gimli Chamber of Commerce hosted a welcoming party for the UK workers at the Viking Hotel. The local paper reported that UK workers were surprised by the warm welcome they received from the Gimli locals. The World Trade workers would be housed in the former base hospital, as temporary housing was in short supply in Gimli. Grumbling about the World Trade workers soon surfaced on the Saunders factory floor. The local experienced Saunders employees that come over from CAE found out that the World Trade workers were getting paid more for doing the same work. Adding to their frustration, the sheet metal workers found out that each heron was spelled slightly differently. Perhaps a tolerance of the assembly jigs used at the de Havilland factory in the UK was not as precise as expected. Thus, the Gimli workers found out that one new part made for one ST-27 heron would not fit the next ST-27. This meant more hand trimming and fitting of sheet metal parts was required, increasing the man-hours spent on each 27 build. Some parts had to be handmade to fit the aircraft rather than what was shown on the drawings. Near the end of 1971, Saunders Aircraft received word that the Columbia Department of Civil Aeronautics would accept a Canadian DOT type certificate for the ST-27, and DOT would issue the ST-27 aircraft and airworthiness export papers. On January 18, 1972, Industry Minister Len Evans announced that SAC had sold 5 ST-27s to an unnamed U.S. airline for $2.34 million. Evans nor Saunders Aircraft mentioned that the sale was contingent on the ST-27 receiving the FAA type certification, and that FAA certification could be many months away, if at all possible. Early in 1972, Saunders Aircraft would be starting to use the teal green stylized S logo on their correspondence. January 1972 would see the first of the ACES Airlines ST-27 leave Gimli. The ACES ST-27 looked sharp in the ACES orange paint scheme. George Colson, the president of ACES, would pick up the ST-27 in Gimli, then fly to Columbia via Albany, New York, Miami, Florida, and Kingston, Jamaica. Early in 1972, Saunders Aircraft would contract with Floyd E. Snow at Aviation technical services out of Van Nuys, California to assist with the engineering work at Saunders Aircraft. Floyd Snow received his DER from the FAA in 1955 and formed the company ATS in 1956. Snow and ATS were working with Jack Riley on the Huron with updated engines, the Riley Turbo Skyliner. So ATS was able to bring that hero knowledge to Saunders Aircraft. On certain letters from Saunders Aircraft to DOT, Floyd Snow would be titled as the Chief Engineer for Saunders Aircraft Corporation. Problems with World Trade workers came to a head in early February. The World Trade workers wanted to form a complaints committee at Saunders Aircraft to deal with their working and living condition. Most of the workers were still upset that they were sent to Gimli instead of Montreal. One of the UK workers, Dave Ewing, provided an interview to the Winnipeg Free Press from the Viking Hotel beverage room and said there was a problem at the Saunders Aircraft plant. 14 World Trade workers would be sent back to the UK and the World Trade issue settled down. Also in February, the MDC chairman provided a possible sales lead for an Israeli company, but nothing came out of that potential lead. Saunders Aircraft hoped that since the purchase of the ST-27s by ACES was a foreign sale, the Canadian Export Development Corporation would help finance the sale. William Kelly would travel to Ottawa to lobby for Export Development Corporation financing, but was turned down. Saunders Aircraft turned to MDC to guarantee the loans that ACES would take out from the Bank of Montreal for the first two ST-27s that would be delivered. The amount of money the Manitoba Development Corporation would have to guarantee was $336,000. MDC would receive stock shares in ACES. The ACES loan guarantees were approved by the Manitoba Board of Directors. February 1972 would see the placement of several help-wanted ads for sheet metal mechanics, aeronautical draftsmen, welders, tool and dialing makers, a two-panner, process planner, and supervisor for Saunders Aircraft. A sheet metal worker training program with Canada Manpower and Saunders Aircraft was announced, where students would receive paid on-the-job training at Saunders Aircraft in Gimli. Student relocation expenses to Gimli were also paid for. Housing for the students and SAC employees became an issue. The former PMQ houses in Aspen Park were full. The Evergreen apartments were still not open since the base closed, and any housing in town was spoken for by Saunders Aircraft and other families employed at the Gimli Industrial Park. Some Saunders training students would share a room in the base fire hall. In March of 1972, Saunders Aircraft prepared an in-depth 60-page presentation and funding proposal for the Board of Directors of the Manitoba Development Corporation, outlining Saunders Aircraft plans and cash requirements. The presentation began with the results of a market study that RSBs and Associates had done for Saunders Aircraft. The study showed a demand of 3 ST-27s per month continuing well into 1976. Saunders noted to achieve this goal, a workforce of 1,000 employees would be required. Saunders noted that this is a problem because the Gimli area could not absorb this number in a short time. The financial projections show a requirement which peaks from November 1973 through to April 1973 for an additional $3,250,000. This includes all tooling and development costs for the all-new ST-27B, as well as the design and development costs of a follow-up airplane, the ST-30. The ST-30 can be described as a little Douglas DC-9. The ST-30 will weigh 12,500 pounds empty and have a gross takeoff weight of 25,000 pounds. The ST-30 will carry 30 passengers and will be pressurized. Until early December 1971, the objective was the acquisition of 70 to 75 Herons over the next 3-year period. This would sustain a modest ST-27 production rate until the ST-30 was available. It became evident in early December that that U.S. commuter operators were turning to the Riley or Lycoming conversion of the Heron. This caused an erosion in the supply of Heron airframes, which was approximately 119 airframes worldwide. Plus, the Heron, having built by hand, has caused production problems during the conversion to the ST-27. Saunders Aircraft decided an aircraft identical to the ST-27 would be built from the ground up, not utilizing the Heron airframe. The aircraft would be designated the ST-27B. Several problem areas are solved by introducing the ST-27B. Production rate is governed by market demand and not by the lack of supply of Heron airframes. The ST-27B is an entirely new aircraft and relieves Saunders Aircraft of the conversion stigma. For the purposes of this presentation, Saunders Aircraft is confident that FAA certification of the ST-27 will be received by July 1, 1972, even if Saunders Aircraft has to meet all the FAA special conditions. Also in the presentation, Saunders Aircraft acknowledged serious deficiencies. These deficiencies were revealed in the audits and inspections conducted by Deloitte, Haskins & Sells. Steps have been taken to correct these. An additional marketing specialist has been hired. Production problems were recognized in early 1971 and corrective measures have been taken. John Iverlak of Winnipeg has been hired as a controller to correct some serious financial problems. John Iverlak, a native of Rossburn, Manitoba, is 54 years old. Iverlak had served in the RCF during World War II as a navigator on a consolidated PBY-5A cancer aircraft. Since World War II, Iverlak has been a cost accountant with Air Canada, an internal auditor with John Deere, and the president and general manager of Rambler Canada before becoming an independent business consultant. In later years, Iverlak would recount his wartime experiences in a book called Chronicles of a Nervous Navigator. Also in March 1972, Minister Len Evans announced that Barney Lamb of Ontario Central Airways would relocate his base of operations from Kenora, Ontario to Gimli and would occupy Hangar 1. Barney and Marion Lamb from Moorhead, Minnesota built and operated Barney's Ball Lake Lodge in 1947. Ball Lake Lodge became one of the most prestigious fly-in fishing lodges in northwestern Ontario. Situated on Ball Lake, some 50 miles north of Kenora, it was accessible only by air. In the spring of 1970, the Lambs were notified that Ball Lake was contaminated with mercury. The mercury was in the effluent released by the pulp and paper mill in Dryden, Ontario, 160 kilometers upstream on the English River. Ball Lake Lodge had to close and the Lambs sued the pulp and paper company. Mary Ann Lamb would save all the correspondence and documents relating to the mercury contamination at Ball Lake. In 2000, this collection of information was donated to Harvard University and is now known as the Mary Ann Lamb Mercury Collection. Later in April 1972, Peter Bryan, chairman of Manitoba Development Corporation, delivered a set of briefing notes on Saunders Aircraft for Premier Ed Schreier. The briefing note stated that $4,631,000 had been invested in Saunders Aircraft and that Saunders had grossly underestimated the financial requirements of successfully designed, certified, and manufacture a commercial aircraft, and thus the company had been undercapitalized. It is now projected that a further $5 million investment is required to make the operation viable. Sales of the aircraft have been difficult for the following reason. Neither the plane or the company have a performance record in the industry. Thus, the purchase of an ST-27 is viewed high risk. The market for the ST-27 comprises of third-level commuter carriers, which are, at the time, relatively new companies and are undercapitalized and can't afford a new aircraft. Meanwhile, in early May, Saunders Aircraft found itself in a severe cash flow crisis. Manitoba Development Corporation prepared an internal memo on May 5th outlining the advance of funds to Saunders Aircraft on an interim basis. Thomas Alt, the director of Saunders Aircraft, advised MDC that he authorized disbursement of a further $338,000, which was critical. If the funds were not disbursed, the company would be in bankruptcy by May 5th. MDC would deposit $500,000 into the Saunders account. To add to the current problems at Saunders Aircraft, on May 12, Charles Norman of the Manitoba Development Corporation issued a memo to Ian Blick, chairman of the Gimli Industrial Park Authority, outlining as generally conceded that Gimli was not the ideal location for Saunders Aircraft. The main reason being that the difficulty of obtaining skilled labor, and the Gimli location may be undesirable from the viewpoint of the town. The memo went on to say that if Saunders Aircraft was successful, then 600 to 700 people would be employed at the plant, which would attract another 12 to 1,400 people in the service industries, just increasing the population in Gimli to about 6,000 in a very short time. A Winnipeg location would offer a pool of skilled labor and would tend to stabilize Winnipeg's aerospace industry. Norman requested that the possible relocation of Saunders Aircraft to Winnipeg be discussed at the next meeting of the Gimli Industrial Park Authority.